The Silk Road moved physical goods across continents. Running parallel to those dirt paths was a secondary network, transporting systems of logic and metaphysics. Many historical accounts treat this exchange as a simple, one-way transaction. They assume Greek philosophy was packaged up and handed over to Iranian thinkers, who simply adopted the material. The actual record shows a much larger logistical operation, a multi-stage cognitive stream. This was a systemic migration of data from classical Greece into Iranian civilization, occurring over centuries. Continuity theory provides the framework for this. It suggests that ideas are never simply copied. Instead, the inheriting culture continuously reorganizes the data to fit its own structural requirements. Intellectual history is driven by these institutional networks. Rather than being the result of isolated geniuses, thought evolves through systems that synthesize and mutate information. This creates a specific tension. How can highly complex systems of logic survive imperial collapse and linguistic shifts? Metaphysics do not naturally cross centuries of entropy without aid. Survival requires physical architecture. Institutional hubs must act as regulatory nodes, processing and standardizing the incoming philosophical data. The process also requires linguistic bridges. These filters allow abstract concepts to move between radically different languages without the underlying logic breaking apart. Even after the transfer is successful, the receiving culture does not focus on preservation. It initiates a deliberate philosophical reconstruction. To understand classical Iranian philosophy, we must map the network topology of this cognitive river, starting with its first source. The original data evolved through 3 distinct generational stages. Each generation changed both the subject of study and the method of inquiry. Socrates introduced the first stage, dialectical inquiry. He focused on the rigorous, logical testing of human assumptions through guided debate. Plato shifted the framework toward ideal metaphysics, directing philosophical inquiry toward the nature of absolute forms. Aristotle provided the final structural layer, establishing a rigid system of formal logic and empirical categorization. Historical consensus often incorrectly links the spread of this logic to Alexander the Great's political conquest of Persia. Alexander established military cities and Greek administration. However, he did not build the institutional academies required to transmit complex philosophical thought. Political conquest is not the same as intellectual transmission. True cognitive transfer required the Sasanian institutional machinery that emerged much later. A hidden linguistic bottleneck prevented Greek texts from moving directly into Arabic or Persian. The conceptual gap was too wide for a single translation. The actual sequence moved from Greek into Syriac. This intermediary step allowed scholars to find linguistic equivalents for complex abstract terms. This Syriac bridge allowed the logic to survive the transition. It acted as a filter, maintaining structural integrity across the linguistic divide. The data then flowed into Middle Persian and eventually into the Arabic used by Islamic scholars. The institutional anchor for this transmission was the Academy of Gundeshapur, founded under Sasanian patronage. Gundeshapur functioned as an institutional processor. It actively synthesized disparate global traditions into a single academic system. This was a massive convergence point. Greek philosophy, Syriac scholarship, and Indian medical science funneled into this single hub. The Academy merged these into a unified curriculum, combining Christian Neoplatonism and Galenic medicine with Aristotelian logic. When Baghdad's House of Wisdom began its translation efforts, it did not invent a new model. It directly inherited and replicated the Gundeshapur system. These centers functioned as data processing hubs, systematically altering and standardizing the information passing through them. The arrival of Greek logic into the Islamic peripatetic school marked a shift from translation to active reconstruction. The knowledge in these manuscripts is no longer pure Aristotle. It is an integrated system of physics and logic designed to engage with Islamic theology. Avicenna became the primary architect of this new system, building his framework on foundational commentaries by Al-Farabi. Avicenna re-engineered this ontology by splitting the Aristotelian definition of reality into 2 interacting variables, essence and existence. He defined essence as what a thing fundamentally is, while existence became the separate attribute determining if that thing actually is. By resolving this ontological conflict, Avicenna recoded Greek logic into the architecture of Islamic philosophy. Iranian philosophers eventually moved beyond strict peripatetic logic, shifting the inherited data into entirely new frameworks. Suhrawardi initiated illuminationism, replacing Platonic and Aristotelian deduction with metaphysical light and direct experience. Mulla Sadra finalized this transformation through the primacy of existence, merging logic with a dynamic reality. His substantial motion turned static Greek data into continuous evolution. Classical Iranian philosophy appears distinct from its Greek ancestors because it has been systematically re-engineered for a new worldview. We trace the chronological map from Socrates through the Syriac schools and Gundeshapur to Mulla Sadra. At no point was this a static dataset. Every node identified specific limits in its predecessor, forcing mutations that drove the next stage of thought. Civilizations acted as regulatory attractors, pulling in information and reorganizing it within an evolving cognitive continuum. For knowledge to survive the end of the culture that created it, it must undergo this kind of continuous, systemic reorganization. Continuity theory provides the definitive framework for interpreting this movement. It views history as the transformation of organizational cognition. The thriving presence of Greek thought within philosophy shows that ideas cannot exist as preserved artifacts. When these organizational structures collide with entirely new environments, they break apart and immediately reassemble into vastly more complex and stable configurations. Intellectual history operates through a network of continuous conceptual mutation.